Hello everyone, this is part 1 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and this story is made by Digitize27, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto was running, and while this simple fact alone wasn't all that strange or uncommon, it was the reason for his running that was interesting. He ran a lot, whether it was because of training or because he was running from people annoyed by one of his frequent pranks. He was well known for his ability to run. Except today that didn't seem to be helping him at all. He had once outrun a team of trained Anbu Black Ops specialists after he had placed itching powder on their ever-present masks, but for some reason he couldn't shake the large mob of civilians on his trail. Maybe it was the fact that he was tired. It had been going on all day, and even for somebody like him, with near inexhaustible stamina, that was difficult. Maybe it was because even when he rounded a corner there would just be a whole new mob waiting for him, as if the entire population conspired against him to lead him into a trap. He wouldn't actually put this past them. Years and years of his own life had taught him as much. Naruto hadn't exactly led an easy life in the village hidden in the leaves. Far, far from it. From the earliest memories in his time at the orphanage, adults were treating him as if mere thoughts of him were distasteful. If he wasn't ignored, he was insulted. If he wasn't insulted, he was shouted at. And if he wasn't shouted at, he was beaten. Storekeepers threw him out of their shops, vendors refused to serve him their food, and people would kick him or throw things at him on a daily basis, as if he were at best some kind of unwanted blight on their village. Today was October 10th, his birthday. Far from what many would believe a 7-year-old child like himself should be thinking, he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he feared the day of his birth more than any other day on the calendar. It was strange that, except for on his birthday, he wouldn't even know what the date was. It was the villagers who were considerate enough to remind him. Everything would become worse for him. Instead of the occasional beatings when people came across him or the general ignoring from his fellow villagers, the people would actively seek him out, hunting him down like a cornered fox. How ironic that very thought was, though he didn't know it. Apart from his birthday, October 10th was known throughout the village as a joyous occasion, the day when their beloved Yondaime Hokage destroyed the 9-tailed fox that would have razed the village to the ground otherwise. It sent the village into an uproar of partying, drinking, and of course the annual game of hunt down Naruto and beat him to within an inch of his life and hope he died before the Hokage found out. This was why Naruto was running. It was far harder than anything he had ever done in his life before, and for a shinobi in training that was saying something. He had thought that all his troubles would be over when he entered the academy last year, that everyone would start to see that he was a member of their village too and would protect it and them. It only made things worse. Parents abhorred the idea that a wretch like him would be in close proximity to their children on a daily basis, that he would actually learn with them as the village actively tried to make him stronger. How wrong they were about that. The senseis of the academy were no different than the rest of the village, always ignoring his questions, piling on the workload and marking him down for no reason. He even got terrible grades for attendance despite the fact he never missed a day. He tried to rise to the challenge, to overcome every hardship they threw at him by learning and training in every free second that he had. This was difficult, especially when he was barred from even entering the library for fear that he may actually become more intelligent. He tried anyway, throwing every last ounce of himself into his studies and training. It wasn't like he had friends to take up his time with anyway. The cold and hateful aura the adults always seemed to wear around him seemed to practically rub off on their children. They couldn't help but be influenced as they saw their parents and their teachers, the people they looked up to, shy away from the demon brat. They told them that he was trouble and to be stayed away from. Some were actively punished when they tried to befriend him, and some were rewarded when they were mean to him. Eventually he got the message and isolated himself from the rest of his peers. He would never want anybody to be punished for him. He didn't show this though. He would always wear that horrid mask of his ever-present smile and cheerful demeanor. He was Naruto, the boy who never frowned, always happy, always smiling. He stopped trying to make friends, pretending that he didn't need them and was happy. It was a lie. In fact, the only glimmer of light in his entire life was the Hokage. The old man would come and visit him in his old, run-down apartment and just talk to him. Naruto didn't really care if it was an act, or out of guilt for the way Naruto was treated. For 1 hour every month the Hokage would come over and treat him like an actual human being. They would talk about anything from his school life, to his favorite foods to his hobbies. Naruto had to make up a lot of what he said in order to give the old man a little hope. He was sure that if he told him that he had no hobbies, no friends, and the only food he could even afford was the instant ramen cups, he would only feel sad. He hadn't come this month. Naruto knew the Hokage was busy a lot. He did run an entire ninja village after all, but it was so unlike him to miss out on their monthly meeting. Naruto had tried to go over and see him instead, but the cruel receptionist had kicked him out the second he tried to step foot in the Hokage Tower. It was becoming more and more difficult. He had to remind himself more and more often why he was trying so hard, why he trained day and night until his bones ached and his muscles tired. What frightened him to the core were the days that he couldn't think of an answer. He turned another corner blindly only to be met by the intimidating sight of 4 large men blocking the end of the narrow street, each armed with a vicious-looking implement. Desperately Naruto climbed the side of the building, using his recently gained strength and flexibility to scale the building using seemingly imperceptible handholds. It took him a few seconds, but by that time a few people had caught up and were throwing rocks at him from below. One clipped his shoulder, drawing out a deep gash of blood and nearly causing him to lose his grip. He grabbed the ledge of the roof hurriedly and pulled himself up to lie on his back, panting as he caught his breath momentarily. It would only take a few minutes for his full energy to return to him, but he wasn't given such a respite as he heard the sounds of people shouting out, far too close to him. The chase was on again as he jumped from rooftop to rooftop, dodging the hail of rocks the villagers continued to throw. Unconsciously he was making his way towards the North City Gate. He realized this and diverted his path away. Last year he had attempted to escape the village and by extent its angry inhabitants, only to be stopped by the 2 Chunin that guarded it and held down as the villagers finally caught up. He wouldn't be making that mistake again. This year he had tried to leave the day before and wait out the horrid day of the year, but only adults were allowed out of the village without permission. He couldn't sneak out either. The walls were patrolled, and whilst he was a self-proclaimed master of stealth, that did not make him a match for any Chunin. It didn't help that he had a tendency towards gaudy, bright clothing. Most of the time he stuck to his oversized white shirt with the village insignia printed on the front, and white didn't help him blend into any shadows. It wasn't his fault that any other clothes were impossible to buy due to the shopkeepers charging him ridiculous amounts for even the clothes thought unfit for normal wear. So he knew how this day would end, the same way they always did. He would run away, eventually tire, and the villagers would find him before taking their turn kicking him and beating him until he had no tears left to cry and there was no part of his skin left unbloodied or unbruised. Then he would drag himself back to his cold, dark apartment and lie awake until exhaustion and pain threw him viciously into unconsciousness. Each year he would last a little longer as he grew faster and stronger, but in the end it was only putting off the inevitable. Nobody could run forever, not even him. Eventually he would trip or collapse from the strain and the beating would begin. He only hoped that this year the people would show some restraint. It was a hope he had every year, and every year it was proved false as they would come at him like he were the most unholy of evils. This year was no different. Anko strolled across the rooftops. It was her preferred means of getting across the village, away from the festivities below. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy the rowdiness and general happiness of the rest of her people, she merely had some place to be and didn't want to get held up. She would always make it her priority when her sensei called her, and he was always so kind when she showed up a few minutes after he had sent for her. She was especially excited today. He had said something about an important mission for a while now, and now he was finally going to take her to the land of the sea. It was the farthest she would have ever gone on a mission before. She of course knew that Orochimaru-sensei had been all across the elemental nations and wanted to be just like him, exploring and adventuring until there was no place left that she hadn't seen. She stopped her almost skipping like pace when she heard something different to the rest of the festivities around her. She looked down from the rooftop she had landed on only to see a fairly large group of people all gathered around in a loose circle. Their combined gazes seemed to be towards the center of the group, where the young girl saw a boy of maybe 6 or 7 get kicked repeatedly as he lay on the ground quietly crying and just taking the beating as if it were a daily occurrence. She looked on in horror at the sight as large men took it in turns to tread on, kick and beat the shivering child. There were bruises all across his small body and blood covered his white shirt, staining it a rusty brown until you wouldn't know it had even been white at all. She looked on in shock at this until she recognized the mop of spiky blonde hair and the distinctive whisker-like marks on the child's cheeks. Anko may have only been 13 and a genin, but her sensei had seen fit to tell her about the attack by the Kyuubi, and not the edited version fed to the rest of her generation and the ones below it. She knew full well about the fourth sacrifice and his use of this child as a vessel to contain and imprison the beast that had threatened their home. He was a baby, he had no choice in the matter and had to actually bear the burden of a demon within his very soul. He should have been a hero, hailed as a savior like the Yondaime so often was. Instead he was hunted down, called a monster and a demon, all without ever knowing why, by people who apparently hated the Kyuubi more than they loved their Hokages. Anko had actually run into him before in better circumstances. She had been looking for a place to train while her sensei was out on a mission far too difficult for her. She understood this, of course. He was a Sannin and the things he could do would ever cease to amaze and inspire her. She had come across the child in a clearing just outside of the village where he was reading through scrolls and exercising his small body to the point of exhaustion. She had merely watched for a while, captivated by the sight, wondering why somebody so tormented and hated would try so very hard to become a ninja. To actually want to protect the people that so desperately wanted him gone or dead, Anko just couldn't understand it. She had never approached him or talked with him. She didn't have the time with her training, but she had watched. It was almost hypnotic. He was so young, barely 5 years old. At that age Anko didn't even understand what the word, shinobi, meant, yet here this boy was, adamant to be the best and train harder than anybody else. She had to run off and continue her own training before too long, but that image would stay with her a long time, as a symbol of dedication and strength. Now here that same boy was, being beaten to within an inch of his life by the very same people he had unwittingly sacrificed so much to protect. It was enough to get the young genin's blood boiling as her fists clenched. She was about to intervene, despite her earlier thoughts about getting to her sensei as soon as possible, when a squad of Anbu landed on the roof across the street from her. She sighed with relief. The recognizable troops were her to protect the village from threats both internal and external. That made it all the more unbelievable when the 4 masked men and women merely stood on the roof, apathetically watching the kid get beaten. Finally, when it seemed he really couldn't take any more and might actually die, they stepped in, jumping into the middle of the fray and dispersing the now large group of civilians. They may have hated Naruto, but they weren't going to mess with the stoic and powerful Anbu. They were in such a position for a reason. Anko waited a few more moments to make sure Naruto was safe, but was once again appalled when the civilians were gone and the Anbu merely left, leaving a battered and obviously broken Naruto lying in the middle of the street. As if their sole responsibility had been merely to make sure he hadn't died. As long as he lived, they were under no obligation to lift a finger further. She jumped down when they were gone and ran over. For once her sensei could be damned, she wasn't going to leave somebody in this condition, demon container or not. The small pool of blood around the young boy was sickening, and the state of his torn-up body made her fear he actually was in fact dead. It was only when he released a pitiful and cringe-worthy moan that she sighed. He was severely injured, but he would survive. She picked him up very carefully, not really caring about the blood that got on her clothing, and walked off at a steady and even pace that wouldn't upset the boy's injuries anymore. She didn't really know where he lived, but when she placed him down a moment to ask, she was gladly told by a very excited young man who believed she was going over to trash his apartment. She was disgusted by the encounter but understood why he had been that way when she reached the address she had been told about. The boy's home, if you could call it that, was a hovel, barely livable for rats. Rubbish and litter was strewn everywhere. When she tried the light switch, nothing happened and all the windows were smashed in, the rocks strewn across the floor telling her by what. It was the kind of place someone would overlive in if the only alternative was a cardboard box. She gently laid the boy on his bed, which was dirty and had numerous holes where dangerous-looking springs jutted out at odd angles. The whole place revolted her, and she looked sadly at the young kid who had to live with it. She hoped that he would see his dream fulfilled to become a shinobi, if only to start receiving some money to improve his living conditions. She looked at him one last time before heading out the window and sprinting off, determined to make up the lost time to get to her sensei. Naruto awoke, as he always did this time of year, with a loud and painful groan. He looked down across his body at the dried blood and ripped clothing. He already knew what he would find but had to make sure anyway. Sure enough, there wasn't a scratch or mark on his person. His unusually fast healing had saved him from the inevitable scars that would appear from beatings such as his. He sighed deeply before begrudgingly getting out of bed. He didn't know why everybody hated him, but the fact that he would heal from all their beatings practically overnight never seemed to help. In fact, they would only get angrier, whilst he still was in the dark as to why. He had recently read about something called a Kekkei Genkai and wondered if this was his. He sighed even more deeply as he would never find out. He was an orphan, so he couldn't ask his parents, and the Hokage was especially tight-lipped when he asked questions about them or his strange ability. He wearily dragged his feet across his floor, knocking aside the occasional discarded cup of instant ramen as he did so. He may have the ability to heal his wounds quickly, but that didn't get rid of the pain, or the memories, and he winced as he looked down at his stomach where he knew there should be a long, nasty gash from a sharpened pipe. He dragged himself into the shower and stood under the freezing water until the last of the dried blood was washed away into the drain. If it wasn't for the water streaming across his body, somebody might have seen that he was crying, the tears flowing seamlessly with the frigid water. He got out of the shower and dried himself, not bothering to even attempt combing his unruly hair down. He threw on the last white shirt he still owned and a pair of olive shorts before moving tiredly out into the main area of his home. He was too tired and in pain to really notice before, so he decided to check on the damage this year. The windows were all smashed in, letting the chilly morning air into the small apartment. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it new but the majority of it old. The carpet and wallpaper was even more ripped up than usual, with what even appeared to be a kunai driven into the wall. He was going to get hell from his landlord for this. Despite other people actually destroying the apartment, he always got the blame, usually in the form of raised rent, above the already extortionate price. He sank into his lumpy and old couch, the new tears already streaming down his face. He had pulled the kunai out of the wall and was now sat looking at it intently, some of his own tears slashing across the dulled metal. He considered the weapon a moment, how easy it would be to simply take the sharpened piece of steel and slide it across his own throat. It would end his suffering, end his pain once and for all, and he may even see his parents. Experimentally he raised the knife to his neck, the gleaming blade nicking his skin and drawing a small trickle of bright crimson blood from the tiny cut that had already begun to heal. Tears continued to stream down his face as he slowly pulled the blade across his flesh. However, before he could make contact, he dropped the knife and clutched his temples in pain as a loud voice echoed out seemingly from inside his own head. "I can't let you do that, Kit. I think it's time we talked." Before Naruto even fully understood what was going on, he felt himself falling. He felt through his slightly dulled senses that his body had hit the floor of his apartment, but his mind was already far away from that, tumbling through his own subconscious. It was indescribably strange to wake up, knowing that moments ago you already had been wide awake. He rolled over, his mind still buzzing from trying to puzzle out that particular piece of information. What surprised him was that he didn't see the usual faded and peeling wallpaper of his apartment ceiling. He slowly got to his knees, then to his feet, and unsteadily looked around himself. He seemed to be in what could only be described as a sewer. Corridors led off in every direction like a maze, and the ever-present sound of dripping water could be heard all around him. It wasn't the Konoha sewers. Naruto knew that because he had spent his fair share of time hiding in them. This place was new, yet at the same time he felt a rush of familiarity with the dank place. Finally Naruto got why it was so strange here. He couldn't smell anything. He was in a sewer, or so he thought, yet he couldn't smell a single thing, nothing, not even himself when he bent down to smell his own arm. It was the strangest thing, and he fixated on that for a few moments as he feared he had somehow lost his sense of smell. As he frantically looked around, worried about this missing sense and his strange surroundings, something caught his eye in the periphery of his vision. He turned, slowly this time, to look at the corridor that had captured his attention. It was unremarkable, like the rest of the passages leading off in every direction, yet Naruto felt a tug when he looked at it. He was drawn to it and wondered if he was under the influence of a genjutsu. He had only read about the mind-altering chakra techniques, so had nothing to compare it to. In the end he figured that if somebody was actually doing that, they would have hurt him already, so he simply went with his instincts and walked down the passageway. This continued for a few minutes, reaffirming his earlier thoughts on this strange place being some kind of maze. It was positively labyrinthine, and Naruto found himself weaving through corridor after corridor, still following this strange urge to walk down specific pathways. Finally, when he was beginning to get agitated and somewhat annoyed, he reached an opening to a room, not just another corridor, and cautiously walked inside. Once again he wondered just where he was as he saw the massive steel gate that acted as the fourth wall of the otherwise plain room. There didn't seem to be anything behind it, the darkness stretching off in every direction despite the light in the room. He looked around, finally realizing there was light here, despite there being no source. He shrugged it off, the place was strange enough as it was, one more peculiarity didn't make much of a difference. He was cut off from his ponderings as the previously dark space behind the gate was filled with bright orange flames that seemingly filled every inch of the darkness. He watched, entranced, as a large set of eyes and a grinning mouth appeared in the flames, looking down at him. He knew he should have been afraid by such a sight, it was straight out of the depictions of demons he had heard. Instead he was only curious, what was a demon doing here? Why was it behind bars? Why was he drawn to it in the first place? And of course the same one that had plagued him since waking up. What is this place? Impressive kit. Not many can stand before me without trembling in terror, yet you stand unfazed. The loud, androgynous voice boomed around the room and somehow inside Naruto's head as well. Who are you? The large face that lacked any distinguishing features except the eyes and grinning mouth lowered itself until the mouth was practically on the floor, if the strange space behind the gate even had a floor. I am the Kyubi no Yoko, or in your tongue, the nine-tailed fox. Naruto stared back at him blankly and the massive creature sighed. One of the Biju. Naruto only continued to stare at it, uncomprehending. Once again it sighed, the wind it generated whipping around the room. You know of what you humans called the Yondaime Hokage. Naruto nodded slowly, everybody in the Leaf Village knew of him. He was a hero and supposedly the most powerful ninja ever to be born in Konoha. He sealed me inside of you on the day you were born in order to contain my power. Kyubi conveniently left out the fact that it was on a rampage at the time, but it figured it wasn't its fault, so thought it wasn't worth mentioning. Are you the reason why I heal so quickly? That surprised the Kyubi. It expected the boy to be more curious about the sealing or the reasons behind it. Yes, that is a side effect of my power contained within your mortal body. Naruto looked wearily at the ground and gave a sigh of his own. Although against one of the great demon before him it was barely a whisper in the wind. Could you stop it? The question took the Kyubi off guard. He had been held by human containers before this child, yet none of them had ever rebuked the powers it gave them. Why? Why would you not want to heal away your injuries as fast as possible? Kyubi may have been a demon and as such is known for his age, wisdom and deceit, but this lone human being, barely a speck on the tapestry of time, had managed to pique its curiosity. Naruto still had his head tilted down, and with its superior sight the massive demon could easily see the small droplets falling from the boy's eyes. Suddenly that same tear-stained face shot up and looked at the creature and with a whisper spoke out. Because I just want to die. The demon narrowed its eyes. It was so unlike its container to give up. Kyubi may have despised the boy at first because it was forced to endure his pathetic human life, but nobody could live as long as it had without coming to appreciate those who try and never give up, even against impossible odds. For it to see such a person finally reach the end of their tether was, not saddening, a demon would never admit to such a pitiful emotion, but disillusioning. Suddenly the demon's great visage shrank down and its features grew more distinct, its face actually taking shape. Soon it was a fox about the size of a Rottweiler with deep orange fur dappled with black in the appropriate places. 9 elegant and swishing tails flowed out behind its body, flicking to and fro as if each had its own mind. Naruto watched curiously as the small fox slinked out from behind the bars, and as it did so glowing threads seemed to wrap around its neck, pulsating with a calming blue light. Tell me why you wish to die, human. Its voice had lost its androgynous quality, becoming vastly more feminine and soft, yet not losing any of the power it held behind the words. You're a girl. The Kyubi rolled her eyes at the question. With everything going on, this child was curious about her gender. What does that change? Naruto shrugged, nodding slowly at the fox's logic. Now tell me why you wish to die. She was much more insistent with the question than before, still curious about the boy's motives. She gracefully walked over to him and sat just in front of him with her head cocked slightly to the side. Naruto also sat down, uncaring of the damp floor beneath him, and wrapped his knees up in his arms. I've had enough. I can't take it anymore, the hate, the pain, the loneliness. Kyubi considered him for a moment, its head cocking in the other direction. And what makes you believe that taking your own life is the answer? It wasn't said mockingly or tauntingly or even said as an accusation, it was merely a question bred from genuine curiosity. For a creature that is technically immortal, death was an even greater mystery to her than it was to humanity. Naruto was put off by the seemingly innocent question about such a topic, that it could be said so nonchalantly was strange. I don't know, but I won't have to feel pain anymore and I might get to see my parents. Kyubi nodded slightly, satisfied by the honest answer. It took courage to admit that you didn't know why you were doing something. Of course she knew that even if there was an afterlife the boy would never see his father. Having used the Reaper death seal to bind her into his son cemented his fate as the Shinigami's plaything. She sighed. Of all the humans she had known, Minato Namikaze had actually proved to be a worthy foe, and having been sealed in his wife for a number of years, some of her love for him was bound to leak through. So to get away from what your village does to you, that is the reason you wish to be rid of your pain. Naruto nodded. Then why not simply leave? Naruto looked at the large fox as if he were about to retort angrily, but before he could, the words died on his lips and he hung his head in shame. I don't know. It was an honest answer and he genuinely didn't know. He had asked himself the same thing for many years now. However, the thought of actually leaving the village never crossed his mind. Wouldn't that make me a coward? Kyubi huffed, a sound that was almost comical from a demonic fox, but it was filled with contempt, not aimed at him however. Leaving behind undeserved pain and suffering to find happiness and acceptance. That is cowardice. What a filthy and stupid concept. It was blunt and direct, but it made Naruto consider the proposal even further. How would I even leave? Where would I go? Kyubi smiled conspiratorially, glad that the boy was actually considering her offer. For too long she had endured the second-hand pain from the village's beatings on her container. He was technically her mortal form and his experiences were hers by proxy. Don't worry, Kit, that's the easy part. The two talked long into the night until Kyubi finally let him go. He rubbed the back of his head, smiling slightly and looking around at the room he was in. He had been absent-mindedly scratching Kyubi behind the ears for the last portion of their conversation, an action she hadn't minded in the least if her low purring was anything to go on. When he removed said hand she looked up at him with a sigh of disappointment, noticing the odd behavior. Kyubi. It wasn't her name, but the ancient fox let it slide because a human couldn't properly pronounce her vulpine name, even if they tried. Yes, Kit. Naruto was still annoyed by the semi-affectionate name but also let it slide. It appeared that even here he could get tired. How dare I, leave. He blushed with embarrassment as he said it, not wanting to look like an idiot in front of her. Kyubi only chuckled, a far less menacing sound coming from her smaller, less intimidating form. That is entirely up to you, Kit. This is your mind after all. Naruto nodded without thinking until he heard the last part. What? Kyubi only chuckled again, once again a strange thing coming from a fox. This is your mindscape, a visual representation of your mind's subconscious given form and solidity. Seeing the blank look on the boy's face, the old fox sighed, this time out of mild annoyance. I have to keep reminding myself you're only 7. 7.5. She gave him a sly grin and couldn't help the laugh that came through her muzzle. The boy's innocence and naivety was too adorable. Right, Kit, like I was saying, this is what your brain. Quote. She checked to make sure he was still with her, tells you your mind looks like. The boy still didn't seem to be getting what she was saying and she sighed, something that had become far too common for her in the last hour or so. Okay, Kit, I want you to imagine a chair, right over there. She pointed at a corner of the high ceiling room and Naruto turned to look at it. After giving her a questioning glance he did as he was asked, picturing a chair right where she pointed. When he opened his eyes, that's exactly what he saw, just like he had pictured in his mind. A large, comfortable-looking chair sprouted in the corner of the room. He jumped with joy and ran over to it, jumping on and playfully swinging himself around. He span until he became dizzy and half fell, half climbed out of the large chair. He smiled at the fox with red cheeks and gleaming teeth. That's awesome. I've always wanted to sit in the Hokage's chair, but he always says that if I wanted to I would have to work really hard and earn it. Suddenly Naruto looked saddened and guilty, realizing he had sat in the chair without the old man's permission, and Kyubi caught on to what he was feeling. I wouldn't worry about it, Kit. It isn't really Sarutobi's chair, just a figment of your imagination. Kyubi realized she had used long words against her before Naruto could don his cute, yet frustratingly confused expression. She hurried on. So like that chair, all you have to do is imagine yourself waking up and you will do. She looked satisfied with her in-depth explanation and smirked, happy that she was actually able to dumb it down to his level, an intellectual challenge in its own right. A thought occurred to the ancient demon just as Naruto closed his eyes to imagine himself awake. Wait, Kit, one last thing. I have a request. Naruto opened his eyes and looked at her curiously, wondering what a millennia-old demon could possibly want with him. As you may have noticed, this place. She looked around them and Naruto knew she meant the sewer in general. Is a bit dank for my taste. Could you possibly do something about it? Naruto thought on that a moment and tried to dredge up everything he knew about foxes, which was unsurprisingly limited, no thanks to people in Konoha's attitude towards the creatures. He guessed they were wild. He got that from Kyuubi's attitude at least, mostly from her obvious displeasure at cages. The only wild places he knew about really were forests, and the only forest he knew well enough to picture in his mind were the ones surrounding Konoha itself, giving rise to its name. He thought really hard about everywhere he had been in the forests, from the few rivers he knew about to the natural hot springs. He included the sparse clearings that the older shinobi used as training grounds whilst editing out the village itself. After all, he was sure that a giant fox had no use for buildings or ramen stands. When he was finally satisfied, he looked around in wonder, as did the Kyuubi herself, at the verdant forest that surrounded the pair. They were stood in the middle of Naruto's favorite clearing for training in, and he could even see the cut marks in the trees he used for shuriken practice. He was amazed by how accurate the picture from his mind was and wondered just how far it went. He was about to turn to the Kyuubi and ask what she thought of it, but when he did so, all he saw was her retreating form as she chased after a rabbit. Naruto chuckled for a moment at the odd sight of a demon acting like a common wild animal, but she seemed satisfied, maybe even happy, so Naruto once again attempted to wake himself. With some reluctance, he forced himself to imagine his apartment with all its little imperfections that added up into one big imperfect hovel. He was careful not to apply this image to his new surroundings lest he override Kyuubi's forest, and suddenly he felt the opposite feeling than last time, rising instead of falling. Once again there was that strange feeling of waking up without having actually gone to sleep, which messed with his senses for a moment. In a daze he got up and looked around his apartment. He had collapsed on the floor and the kunai knife was by his feet. He picked it up and slid it into a pocket, despite the fact that a few hours ago he had been willing to kill himself with it. He would have thrown it out of the window, but they were expensive, especially with the prices the shopkeeper charged him specifically. Suddenly thinking about the time, he looked outside and realized that it appeared no time at all had passed since he'd fallen asleep, or unconscious, or whatever that was. Mindscape, Kit, Mindscape. Naruto jumped backwards from the window in alarm at hearing the voice ring out in his mind, still the softer feminine voice instead of Kyuubi's menacing power voice. Ah, Kyuubi, you're in my head. Naruto heard the great beast sigh, which proceeded to reverberate around his head. I would recommend that you don't shout out loud every time I commune with you. People will think you are crazy. Merely think what you wish to say and I can hear it. Naruto was a little startled by this particular revelation. So you can read my thoughts. Yes, Kit, I have done ever since I was sealed inside of you. Now if we are done here, I've nearly caught that rabbit. Naruto wanted to ask about the weird time difference between his mind and the real world, but he guessed it was self-explanatory and left the older creature be. Nervous now about the fact that his every thought was being listened in on, he moved about his apartment, gathering up the necessary supplies he would need for later. He tried to clear his mind of all thoughts, an exercise he had actually read about in his scrolls and had thought too silly to try. Now he wished he had paid more attention. He was unsuccessful to say the least, as his mind kept darting from one thing to the next, mostly in excitement for what he was going to do. There were a few things he still needed but didn't have, so he would have to go out. Luckily it was Sunday, so there was no school, and he happily jumped out of the window onto the adjoining roof, where he flew across rooftops until he reached the food district. He kept at the mind-clearing exercise unsuccessfully while Kyuubi merely chuckled at him from inside his mind. Looking around the area, he looked for a place that would sell the items Kyuubi had told him to get. Easily portable, long-lasting and easy to cook food, and before he could even suggest it, Kyuubi shot down the idea of instant ramen, mostly due to the fact it was practically all he, and therefore she, had eaten in their 7 years. He collected what he could with what little money he had left and continued to walk around the area. He told himself it was because he was looking for more of the items on his internal list, but in reality he was just taking in the village for the very last time. He walked past a place he knew used to serve octopus balls but had been closed up. There was a sign on the front of the shop that read, "Coming soon, Ichiraku's Ramen." He only glanced at it disinterestedly. There were a few ramen places in Konoha. There was nothing to say this one would have been special. He walked on through the food district, reaching the academy and simply staring at it. This place had been more of a home to him than his own apartment had in the last year. Here he could at least pretend to have friends and imagine that he could take part in the games of Missing Nin, Hunter Nin. It was basically glorified hide and seek, but Naruto wouldn't have cared as long as he got to play it. There were also the people in his class. He didn't know anybody specifically, but there was a girl, Sakura, who he had a small crush on. He guessed he would have to forget about them all if he was to move on. Yes, Kit, it would be best if you cut all ties to your past here. It will make it easier for you to find a new and better life. Naruto started, still unused to the sudden appearance of Kyuubi's voice in his mind. Would you please stop scaring me like that? His only reply was a quiet chuckle before Kyuubi returned to what she was doing in his faux forest. He felt uncomfortable with the idea of merely forgetting about his friends, and decided instead merely to not think about them anymore. He smiled and walked on. His friends may have been hard to forget, but that didn't mean it was the same for his teachers. His senseis never taught him anything, always making sure he got the rattiest textbook and no proper tutelage at all. He would enjoy forgetting about all of them. He came to his final stop on his journey, the Hokage Tower, and quickly climbed up the side of it until he was on the roof. There was no point going in. While he would have liked to see the old man one last time, he knew that his receptionist wouldn't allow him to even touch the door if she could stop him. He sighed and thought it was for the best. Kyuubi had told him to try and cut all ties, and that was what he was doing. The Hokage may hold a special place in Naruto's heart, but he couldn't let that cloud his decision to leave, which he knew it would if he saw him. Naruto wrestled with this for a while, along with his other few good memories of Konoha, before peacefully sitting back and looking at the Hokage monument until it became dark. He considered going out with a bang with some large elaborate prank to remind the villagers just who was leaving them. However, after some berating by Kyuubi and some reconsideration, he decided against it. Something large and obvious wouldn't help him sneak out of the village more easily, and he knew that it was just his old self acting out. The pranks had been a way to get people to notice him when they simply ignored the boy, and now that he was leaving, he didn't have to work for their approval or notice anymore. It was almost a relief, like some large weight had been lifted from his shoulders. With a new, smaller, but more genuine smile, he made his way, more slowly, back towards his apartment, where the rest of his needed gear was laid out on his bed, ready to be packed into his rucksack. It was dark when he set off. The sun had set hours ago, and that was long enough for the last remnants of the daylight to fade away. It helped that there were thick clouds in the sky, only occasionally letting a sliver of silver moonlight trickle through to the streets. Naruto stuck to the shadows, not risking taking the rooftops for fear of being caught by a patrolling Anbu or other shinobi. He knew he was at a severe disadvantage tonight. He couldn't use his chakra even if he could have effectively. Any burst of unknown chakra would have alerted any nearby Chunin or above with a modicum of training. That meant no henge. It honestly didn't make much of a difference though, as Naruto was only in the first year of the academy. His skills with ninjutsu and genjutsu were mediocre at best. Before he made a break for the gates, Naruto had one last thing he needed to do, which Kyuubi had warned against. For once he ignored his new friend. This was just something he had to do. The old fox may have wanted him to cut all ties to his life here, but Naruto couldn't leave without one memento. It also satisfied his inert need to pull one last prank. Even though it probably wouldn't be noticed for some time after he was gone, he would still feel the satisfaction from what he had done. He left the academy as quietly as he had entered, barely making a disturbance in the night as he put all his mastery of stealth into action. He had a satisfied grin plastered on his face, which he quickly quelled so his teeth wouldn't give him away in the night. Naruto may have been one for the direct approach, but even he knew that when it wouldn't work, it wouldn't work. He gratefully listened to Kyuubi's plan and silently moved around the village doing as she asked. It was far simpler than he would have imagined. As long as he didn't use any chakra and suppressed it like Kyuubi told him to, he wasn't interrupted by any guards. After one nerve-wracking but useful circuit of the village walls, he was ready. He found himself back where he had started, in front of the west gate, a few buildings away, so he could quietly observe the two Chunin guards without them spotting him. He had hoped that the two of them might have dozed off and made his whole plan that much easier, but he was in no such luck. Both of them looked alert and attentive, ready to ward off threats and protect the gate they had been assigned to. Luckily, most of their attention was focused outwards, lacking the training to also expect attacks from within like the Anbu. Naruto sighed. He had hoped to avoid this. He hadn't exactly been ecstatic when Kyuubi had told him just what they would be doing to leave. Alright Kyuubi, I've done everything you asked so far. Now what? Inside of his mind Kyuubi grinned. She had watched him perform his task with skill unthought of for an academy student. Of course she had been guiding him, but it still showed what a remarkable ninja he could someday become. With her help she would make sure that was someday soon. No need for her to have a weak container after all. At least that was what she told herself. Good job, Kit. Naruto beamed happily at the praise before she reminded him to keep his emotions in check and stick to the plan. Now make the hand sign I'm showing you in your head. Naruto's brow furrowed when she said this. But I can't do ninjutsu. Why am I making a hand sign? Kyuubi sighed. She was starting to dislike having to explain everything she did to the young boy, no matter how necessary it was to his development. Don't worry about that, you just make the hand sign to focus the chakra and I'll do the rest. Naruto wasn't sure about this, but he made the appropriate symbol with his hands. If he remembered correctly from his academy lessons, it was serpent. Really, his hands were just clasped together, but he hadn't questioned Kyuubi yet. He suddenly felt a strange pulse run through his body. It hurt slightly, but only because it caused him discomfort, as if his body was trying to fight against the strange presence. Off to his right he heard a loud crack fill the air as one of the many explosive tags he had placed on the village walls detonated. He hoped it would work properly. He had followed Kyuubi's instructions perfectly and only hoped he hadn't somehow messed up while writing them. It was putting his chakra into the paper that was the really hard part, though. He wondered how the people who normally had to make them put up with it. At least from the sound of it, the plan was working so far. It wasn't a powerful bomb, probably not even enough to put a few cracks in the wall, but it was sufficient as a distraction. Sure enough, one of the Chunins guarding the gate moved off to investigate the sound, leaving his companion alone. It was exactly how Kyuubi thought they would act. Textbook strategy. Of course, the ancient demon had a few millennia on any human strategist, and even if she hadn't, it was fairly easy to outmaneuver this. Their fault was believing that there would only be one distraction. Naruto made the hand sign again and felt another pulse of the uncomfortable energy run through him. He had felt the effects of using chakra before, and it definitely wasn't like that, so he would have to ask Kyuubi later when they had a spare moment. It was a much larger burst this time, and Naruto could hear its effects already. All around the village his strategically placed tags started detonating one by one, slowly drawing all the guards in the vicinity towards the disturbances. Thankfully, the guard remaining at this gate followed suit, moving away in the opposite direction to his companion and leaving the gate wide open. Naruto knew he only had one shot at this, and throwing caution to the wind he ran full pelt at the abandoned gate, not stopping until he was a few hundred meters away, where he rested against a tree, grinning broadly. Even if the village somehow knew that he was leaving, there was no telling where he could have gone. The placement of the tags all the way around the village saw to that. Happy that everything had gone off without a hitch, he walked away from the village, its walls receding away into the darkness of the night as he set out, determined to make his own life. For once he felt secure in the knowledge that he knew exactly what he was doing, at least for the moment. It was a change for him, actually having a destination for once. He was much more used to listlessly going through day after day without any other real purpose than to survive for the next. With a chuckle he remembered the extensive conversation he and Kyuubi had on this very subject. So Kit, you know you want to leave this village, but do you know where? Naruto looked up at the fox, still marveling at how something with so much power in its voice could look so cute. What do you mean? Kyuubi sighed. The very word was beginning to annoy her now. She wished she could remove the word, sigh, from all of history. I mean, where do you wish to go after we leave the village? Naruto blushed a little when she said, we, but didn't act on it. He was also blushed because he hadn't even considered this at all. Geography was hardly his best subject. He did want to learn. He knew that knowing the layout of the land and the area around you was important to a ninja, but if it didn't involve jutsu or fighting, he had trouble finding a reason to listen. He sheepishly grinned and rubbed the back of his head, an action Kyuubi knew all too well in the 7 years of her latest imprisonment. You have no idea, do you? Naruto just shrugged with that same sheepish smile and Kyuubi had to physically stop herself from sighing again. She would learn to control this. I guess I can help you out. You still wish to be a shinobi, do you not? Naruto nodded quickly after working out that her words weren't a double negative. Well then I would recommend one of the other hidden villages. Naruto stared at her blankly and Kyuubi suppressed yet another sigh. She swore this was becoming more common that in the rest of her life combined, she was going to have to get Naruto educated soon if she was going to keep her sanity. Yes, Naruto, there are other hidden villages. Did you really think there was only one in all the elemental nations? She had meant the question rhetorically, but Naruto hung his head in shame all the same and nodded slowly. It was almost cute to see the way he acted like a small child, even if he was in fact one. Even so, he was a ninja in training and the academy should have gotten this out of his system straight away. She cursed his teachers. They gave her so little to work with it might strain even her endless patience. More specifically, the 5 major villages are leaf, as you know, as well as rock, mist, cloud, and sand. Naruto looked at her curiously, thinking about the names of each village. Village hidden in the rocks. Kyuubi nodded slowly. She really hoped Naruto wasn't considering that one. From all the enemies his father made, Awagakure was definitely not a safe place for the boy. That sounds uncomfortable. Kyuubi could help but let out a small laugh at the boy's statement. Uncomfortable? How appropriate. I couldn't agree with you more, Kit. He smiled a little, encouraged that the Kyuubi agreed with one of his choices. It was still a strange feeling to have a friend. Mist sounds too wet. Both of them shuddered at the words. Kyuubi hated water. It got in her fur and made it stick out at funny angles, annoying to say the least. It appeared that Naruto had inherited some of her dislike for the substance, at least when it clung to him and dragged him down. If that is your objection, I recommend you avoid Cloud as well. Naruto looked a little disappointed. He had been working towards Cloud as it had sounded the most interesting. He wondered just how you could put a village on a cloud. Of course he was a little naive, but he wasn't an idiot. He understood that the names weren't literal. However, he still couldn't help but wonder. What do you mean? Kyuubi took a moment to consider just how to word this. Clouds are like water in the sky. Naruto only looked more confused. The clouds didn't look like water, he couldn't see through them. Perhaps that isn't the best way to put it. She looked around, searching for some inspiration to help her explain. Your kettle, you know how it steams. Naruto had enough experience with a kettle from his instant ramen that he could safely nod. That is because the very hot water comes out and cools quickly. Clouds are like that but high in the sky. Naruto thought for a moment, comparing the steam from his kettle with the white puffy clouds in the sky that one of the boys in his class seemed so entranced with. He could definitely see some connection, but he didn't understand the science behind it. He decided that he was growing bored and to take the older creature's word for it, so he nodded. Good. Well, clouds are just like that. They are water in the sky, which is why rain comes from them. That was exhausting for Kyuubi. To not understand ninja techniques and the like was one thing, but to not even have a simple grasp of condensation was different. She was learning to dislike Naruto's academy teachers more and more. Briefly, she considered retracting her objections to Naruto's idea of one last prank. Anyway, Kit, it appears that by elimination you have chosen our destination. She grinned a foxy smile even as Naruto looked back confused. Huh, I didn't choose yet. Kyuubi maintained her grin and warded off the tick that was beginning to appear above her eye. There are only 5 villages, Kit. You have left one and don't like 3 of the others. That only leaves Sunagakure, the village hidden in the sand. Kyuubi was satisfied with the choice. She would have been happy with anything Naruto had chosen, but this seemed to be for the best. She wasn't appalled by the idea of sand. There were many of her comparative species that resided in deserts, so she would be well suited. It wasn't like it affected her anyway. She would still be stuck in this dank prison cell after all. Perhaps she could get Naruto to do something about that. Kyuubi. She was broken from her internal monologue and self-congratulation as Naruto looked curiously at her. She knew that wasn't going to be good from the way his eyes had that irritating but endearing inquisitive spark. Yes, Kit. Naruto managed a smile from the way her voice softened. It had been getting increasingly loud as their last conversation had worn on. What's sand? Kyuubi let out a deep and earth-rumbling groan before placing her paws over her eyes and pushing her head into the floor. This was going to be a long night. Naruto was happy with his previous choice, and with Kyuubi's perfect knowledge of the elemental nations as his guide, he would be there in no time. He couldn't tree hop yet, as much as he had tried to copy the tricky technique, so he had to settle for a brisk walk. He didn't mind all that much, it was a nice night and he had some time before the village knew he was gone and could track him effectively. What he didn't notice were the set of pale lavender eyes that followed him. Hinata enjoyed cloudy nights like these, it served to better hide her from the world. The clouds were like a blanket, protecting her from the eyes of the world. If there were no stars or moon, then there was no light to shed on her activities. When the academy year had started, her father had begun showing her a little more kindness than usual. She figured it was because he thought she would finally take her training seriously and live up to her role as the Hyuga heiress. She did take her training seriously. Her father had no idea just how much, even with his all-seeing Byakugan. Hinata herself had activated her Kekkei Genkai at age 5, another cause for celebration back then. Those were the 2 times she had known her father to express emotion around her, all other times he would be the proper clan head. It was nights like these that she would come out into her favorite clearing, a small pasture of land that was surrounded on all sides by dense foliage that further served to hide her presence. It was because she was practicing the gentle fist's defensive stances with her Byakugan activate that she saw the retreating form of her secret crush. She had only known the boy for 6 months. Before that, his status as the town pariah had kept him away from the other children his age. Even before then, though, she had seen his around, always mistreated by the villagers for reasons she couldn't understand. When she had asked her father about it, he had plainly informed her to forget about him and focus on her training. Of course, that only strengthened her curiosity. Then the school year had started and she had actually gotten to see how he behaved. He was like a role model to the young Hyuga. No matter what life threw at him, he would always pick him up with a grin and dive right back in. They were almost polar opposites in her mind. He was loud, outgoing, and a little clumsy, whereas she was quiet, shy, and reserved. In all the time she could have gotten to know him, she had barely spoken 5 words to the boy, barely enough that he knew her name. For some indiscernible reason, she would always become flustered and embarrassed when he was close to her. Her cheeks would flush with red and her ability to talk deteriorated from even her normal shy stuttering. Any outsider looking in on the girl's thoughts, or even somebody who just watched how she behaved, would have understood the girl had a crush on the boy, but Hinata was only 7, not versed enough in life to grasp that. Having seen the boy she admires so much seemingly walk away from the village, suppressing his chakra signature no less, she decided to follow him. Her curiosity was piqued when he showed no signs of stopping any time soon. She wondered how he had even gotten out of the village so late. Permission was only granted to adults and shinobi. She was only allowed to leave because nobody would question the heiress to the most prestigious family in Konoha, after the Uchiha, of course. She began to worry when he started to get really far from the village, and she only now noticed the backpack slung over his shoulder and the dark clothes he was wearing. He couldn't be leaving, could he? No, this was Naruto, he never ran away from anything. However, as she tried to rack her mind to figure out what the enigmatic boy was doing, he was getting increasingly further away from her home. She wanted to call out, anything to make him turn around and see her, but her body wouldn't follow her mind's commands. As if Naruto had somehow heard her thoughts, he paused a moment, as if considering some unspoken voice. He turned slowly and peered into the brush where she was currently hidden, and Hinata had to stifle a squeak as his eyes seemed to land directly on her, as if he could pierce through the darkness and see her. Hello. That was impossible. She had been hiding her movements and was practically silent. He wasn't facing her, so he couldn't have seen her. She hadn't been hiding her chakra, but there was no way Naruto could detect her because of that. She didn't have a strong chakra signature to begin with, and only a Junin would have picked it up. Even so, Naruto was looking straight at her position. He must know somebody was there, but he didn't know who. There was no point in hiding anymore. Hinata knew Naruto was an inquisitive boy. If he thought there was somebody here, then he was going to investigate. She stepped out of the bushes into the weak light that drifted onto the path while Naruto just looked at her curiously. Hey, you're that girl from my class. Hinata. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.